Namaskar. A warm welcome to World News and Indian Perspective on All India Radio. This is Gaurav Sharma and with me is R.S. Raghu bringing glimpses of the major developments of the day from across the globe. Over the next half an hour, we shall bring you the latest from the world of politics, economy, sports, entertainment and more. The headlines. External Affairs Minister of India Dr. Jaishankar to begin 6-day visit to Australia and the Philippines from Thursday. India takes strong exception to China-Pakistan joint statement's references to Jammu and Kashmir, asserts Union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh inalienable part of India. UN's Migration Agency warns that Afghans, especially women and girls, are facing increasing vulnerabilities and protection risks. India's High Commission in Ottawa issues advisory amidst ongoing protests. CBSE to conduct the second-term board examinations in online mode for classes 10th and 12th from the 26th of April. Science and Technology Minister Dr. Jitendra Singh asserts government working to make India the global leader in space technology. And in cricket, India beat West Indies by 44 runs in the second ODI in Ahmedabad. With the new Omicron variant of coronavirus causing concern, we appeal to our listeners to be vigilant and to get fully vaccinated and help others, including children between 15 and 18 years, to get vaccinated. Please continue to follow these 3 simple steps to stay safe. Wear a face mask, maintain 2 gaz ki duri for social distancing, and focus on hand and face hygiene. For any COVID-related information and guidance, contact the national helpline numbers 011-239-78046 and 1075. And now, the news in detail. External Affairs Minister of India Dr. Jaishankar will be on a 6-day visit to Australia and the Philippines from Thursday. In a statement, the External Affairs Ministry said Dr. Jaishankar is paying an official visit to Australia at the invitation of his Australian counterpart, Marie Spain. This will be his first visit as the External Affairs Minister to Australia. It will also be the first high-level visit to Australia from India after the opening of its borders, which were closed following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Jaishankar will be participating in the 4th Quad Foreign Ministers meeting on Friday in Melbourne, along with the Foreign Ministers of Australia, Japan and the United States. The ministers will review the ongoing Quad cooperation and build on the positive and constructive agenda announced by the leaders at the 2 summits in 2021 to address contemporary challenges. Dr. Jaishankar and the Australian Foreign Minister will co-chair the 12th Foreign Ministers Framework Dialogue on Saturday. Subsequently, Dr. Jaishankar will be on a bilateral visit to the Philippines from the 13th to the 15th of February. This will be his first visit to the Philippines as the External Affairs Minister. He will hold talks with his counterpart, Teodoro Locsin. French President Emmanuel Macron has said that the Russian President Vladimir Putin assured him that the Russian forces would not ramp up the crisis near Ukraine's borders. President Macron is on a diplomatic tour of European countries this week. Here's a report.
President Macron arrived in Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, on Tuesday after talks with Mr. Putin in Moscow. Before meeting Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, Mr. Macron reportedly said that he has secured an assurance that there would be no deterioration or escalation in Ukraine crisis. Mr. Macron said there is now the chance to make these negotiations move forward between Russia and Ukraine and that he could see concrete solutions for reducing tensions. Meanwhile, Russia said any suggestion of a guarantee was not right. Russia has denied any plans to invade Ukraine, but it has assembled more than 100,000 troops near its borders. U.S. officials believe Russia has assembled 70% of military forces needed for a full-scale invasion. The tensions between Russia, Ukraine and the West come nearly 8 years after Russia annexed Ukraine's southern Crimea Peninsula. Moscow accuses the Ukrainian government of failing to implement the Minsk Agreement, an international deal sponsored by Germany and France to restore peace to the east. Nina Arkul for World News AIR.
India has said that it resolutely opposes any attempts to change the status quo with reference to Jammu and Kashmir by other countries. External Affairs Ministry spokesperson Arindam Bagchi was replying to media queries on references to Jammu and Kashmir and the so-called China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in the joint statement between China and Pakistan issued on the 6th of February. Mr. Bagchi said that India has always rejected the reference to Jammu and Kashmir in the joint statement. The Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir and the Union Territory of Ladakh have been and are always will remain integral and inalienable parts of India. The statement added that India expects the parties concerned not to interfere in matters that are internal affairs of India. On the so-called China-Pakistan Economic Corridor CPEC, India has consistently conveyed its concerns to China and Pakistan on the projects which are India's territory that has been illegally occupied by Pakistan. The statement called upon the parties concerned to cease such activities. A group of countries part of the Media Freedom Coalition expressed deep concern at what it described as the Hong Kong and mainland Chinese authorities' attacks on freedom of the press and their suppression of independent local media in Hong Kong. In a statement, the governments of several countries, including Australia, Canada, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom and the United States, among others, urged Hong Kong and mainland Chinese authorities to respect freedom of the press and freedom of speech in Hong Kong, in line with the Basic Law and China's obligations under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It said, since the enactment of the National Security Law in June 2020, authorities have targeted and suppressed independent media in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. It added that the ongoing actions further undermine confidence in Hong Kong's international reputation through the suppression of human rights, freedom of speech, and free flow and exchange of opinions and information.
The International Organization for Migration has warned that the ongoing crisis in Afghanistan is intensifying humanitarian needs and increasing displacement risks both inside the country as well as across borders to countries in the region. The UN Migration Agency said that Afghans, especially women and girls, are facing increasing vulnerabilities and protection risks. According to the organization, the conflict last year had forced more than 7 lakh Afghans to leave their homes and added to the 5.5 million people already displaced over past years. In a statement, the UN said that last year Afghans increasingly crossed the border into Iran and Pakistan, describing it as a trend that is likely to continue in the coming months. To respond to the urgent humanitarian and protection needs of more than 3.6 million people in the conflict-stricken country, the IOM is appealing for $589 million. Meanwhile, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan has strongly rejected a recent report by the UNSC monitoring team asserting an increase of foreign groups' activities in Afghanistan. It added that Afghanistan is witnessing exemplary security since the Islamic Emirate regained full sovereignty over the country. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said on Tuesday that he is encouraged by the recent engagement between senior Israeli and Palestinian officials, arguing that piecemeal approaches to the question of Palestine would only ensure that the underlying issues perpetuating the conflict remain unaddressed. The UN chief urged both sides to expand these contacts. Speaking at the 2022 opening session of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, Mr. Guterres said that unilateral steps and illegal actions that drive the conflict must cease. He maintained that the situation continues to be a significant challenge to international peace and security.
EU and India's national investigation agencies and experts held a 3-day regional workshop last week as part of enhanced cooperation on counter-terrorism. The experts shared experiences on how to counter online radicalization. In full respect with freedom of expression online and offline, in a tweet, the EU's delegation in India said that online radicalization is a significant challenge. Terrorist groups are increasingly leveraging online platforms to spread false propaganda, enlist potential recruits, provoke hatred and violence in our societies. The statement added that the participants also deliberated on current challenges and methods adopted by terror outfits for online radicalization and recruitment. They also discussed identifying, preventing, and countering online extremist materials and their sources and policing strategies. India's Army Chief General M.M. Naravane had a telephonic interaction with the commander of the Royal Saudi Armed Forces, Lieutenant General Fahad bin Abdullah Muhammad Al Mutair, on Wednesday. They discussed the aspects of bilateral defense cooperation during the interaction. Amid ongoing protests in Ottawa, India has advised its citizens living in Canada and those planning to visit the country to avoid areas where demonstrations are taking place, urging them to follow instructions of local authorities, including curfews. The Canadian capital city of Ottawa and several other major cities, including Toronto, are currently witnessing protests with road blockages, demonstrations, large gatherings, and general strikes. This has led to disruptions to traffic, public transportation, and shortages of essential items, including food and water, the advisory said. Meanwhile, a special emergency helpline has been set up in the High Commission in Ottawa to provide assistance and guidance to Indian citizens in distress due to the ongoing disturbances in Canada. The helpline number is +1 613 744 3751. The current wave of protests against COVID-19 measures started when thousands of demonstrators gathered in Ottawa expressing strong opposition to vaccine mandates for truckers crossing the US-Canada border.
The Central Board of Secondary Education, CBSE, will conduct the Term 2 board examinations for Class 10th and 12th from the 26th of April 2022. In a notification, the CBSE said that after holding discussions with various stakeholders and taking into consideration the COVID-19 pandemic situation in the country, it has decided to conduct the Term 2 examinations for session 2021-22 in an offline mode. It said Term 2 theory examinations will commence from the 26th of April and the pattern of the question papers will be the same as that of the sample question papers hosted on the board's website. The students will appear at the examinations from the allotted examination centers. The board further informed that the date sheet for Class 10th and 12th will be released soon and will be available on its website. Earlier, in July 2021, the CBSE had decided to conduct the board examinations in two terms, Term 1 and Term 2, due to the uncertainty arising out of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Term 1 examinations have already been conducted by the board recently. In view of the decline in COVID-19 cases, the Delhi University has decided to resume offline classes for the undergraduates and postgraduate courses from the 17th of this month. The University of Delhi is in its order said the outstation candidates are advised to plan to reach Delhi in such a manner that they are able to complete the isolation period of 3 days before reporting to their respective colleges and departments. It said the libraries, laboratories and canteens of the university and the college will be functioning from the 17th of February and they will have to strictly adhere to the COVID-19 guidelines.
In today's Hotspot section, we bring you a discussion on the India-Sri Lanka relations over the years. In conversation are former diplomat Yogendra Kumar and Indrani Bagchi, a journalist.
India had a visitor from Sri Lanka, G.L. Paris. Foreign Minister was in town to meet his counterpart, Dr. Jaishankar, as well as the NSA, Mr. Ajit Doval. The visit by Dr. Paris comes after a breakthrough in relations between India and Sri Lanka, particularly with India extending much needed economic lifeline to Sri Lanka in recent weeks. This, which happened after the visit of the finance minister of the Sri Lankan government, Basil Rajapaksa. So today we will have a chat with Mr. Yogendra Kumar, former diplomat, about how India-Sri Lanka ties look like in this current scenario.
Yes, I think things are looking better in the sense that India is able to, let's say, pursue some of its key interests as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. But I should also mention at the same time that the relationship, just with Sri Lanka, but generally in the region, our relationship or the outlook remains still, I would say, somewhat clouded because of the fact that we had a COVID crisis going on, because of the fact that there is a certain amount of geopolitical uncertainty, and that applies also to in the maritime space as well. Having said that, some of the things that have been stated in the press release by the Ministry of External Affairs and the tweets by the External Affairs Minister and the MEA spokesperson, it certainly appears that in a lot of areas we are making progress. I think that point of view is a good news. I would actually say, before we come to the issues here, one important development in my view, of course, is in recent times the revival of Goa conclave, about which also it was mentioned in the joint statement. Now that's actually a significant development because we already have concretization of an earlier plan which was in some state of limbo during a certain period for obvious reasons, where you have India, Sri Lanka and Maldives coming together to actually do better coordination in terms of maritime security. And where in its current avatar, so to say, we also have the participation as observers of Bangladesh, Mauritius and Seychelles. And the expectation is that I think they'll also join this particular, let's say, conclave, which has secretariat in Sri Lanka. And also they meet at the level of Deputy National Security Advisors, but last time the National Security Advisor actually had gone there last year. So I think this is quite an important development in my view.
Of course, I think there are a couple of sort of big areas that one has to cover. One is Sri Lanka's economy is really in the doldrum. And the lifeline that was extended by India came after they were almost at the point of defaulting on their sovereign debt payments. And that a part of it, of course, has to do with the debt to China. Part of it has to do with their debt to Japan. But part of it is also long-standing economic mismanagement by successive Sri Lankan governments. Yes, while the lifeline gives them a breathing space for the next few months, I think Sri Lanka will have to bite the bullet and take some really hard decisions regarding its economic future. In the last couple of years, the tourism sector has been completely decimated in Sri Lanka. And I think the policies followed by the Rajapaksa government have absolutely done no benefit to the Sri Lankan economy. How do you see that, Mr. Yogendra Kumar?
That's a very big question, really, because as you rightly said, that the mismanagement of the Sri Lankan economy actually began in the previous Rajapaksa government, I should say, particularly his overinvestment in Hambantota and that kind of issue that came up. Of course, that time it opened a certain line for the Chinese. But this continued during the Sena period, and now actually you find it, because the fact of the matter is, there's considerable amount of political fragility within the country. And therefore, in terms of revising the constitution, there's a bit of a kind of the family or a kind of dynastic kind of a political system which seems to be now in place there. So if it can stabilize the political situation, that's well and good. But the question actually is that how do they propose to go about it? And that actually would be a challenge for India as well, because we have, more than China, for example, we have a very high stakes in the political and economic stability of Sri Lanka. I mean, the vulnerability of Sri Lanka to the COVID crisis, for example, the terrorism, very important issues. And we also, if you see our transit, a larger maritime transit actually is via the Colombo port. So what I'm trying to say is that in one way it requires a large scale or larger effort for economic stabilization. I'm not quite clear how the Sri Lankan government is proposing to do that, but I'm sure that the finance minister had come here. I mean, he had conversations with his counterparts. So I'm sure maybe some kind of a thinking is developing as to how they can stabilize all over. I mean, you mentioned about tourism, agriculture sector is not in a good shape. Fisheries sector is not in a good shape. So, and therefore, if you don't find these key sectors of the economy not really in a rebound, then it becomes a larger issue. Of course, we know that Japan is a setback on the Eastern Container Terminal, if you remember, and that was given to the Japanese. Yes. So the point actually that you need a bit of a larger effort along with India to see how the economy can be stabilized. It's not just a question of pumping in money, but also a question of what kind of policies are developed there and how actually, as I said, this kind of an economic stabilization takes place. In fact, I've also read that, for example, India is encouraging Bangladesh also to invest.
Bangladesh actually gave them grant, gave them financial aid last year. The point is, I think at some point, you mentioned the agriculture sector. Frankly, that was a self-goal by the Rajapaksas themselves. And China has refused to restructure their debt. Japan is very angry with them for the kind of cavalier attitude that they had shown on the Eastern Container Terminal. I think at some point they will probably have to look at getting into an IMF program that might have political repercussions for the Rajapaksa government. But I think for the future of the Sri Lankan economy, they may well be left with no choice. The second issue that is important for India, and you mentioned maritime security and the revival of the trilateral between Maldives, Sri Lanka and India, which is actually very, very important. And so it does, I think, some of the steps that Sri Lanka has also taken with India came because Sri Lanka found it had actually no other place to turn to. And I noticed that the Sri Lanka government finally agreed on the Trincomalee oil tank farms after 38 years. And this particular maritime security trilateral that had been set up in, I think, 2011, has been revived, which is all very good. India has had to work very hard to get the Chinese out of 3 islands to the north of Jaffna because the Chinese presence in Sri Lanka remains almost overarching. And how Sri Lanka plans to deal with China, which is, of course, larger than life because of the huge investments that they have made, and balance it with India, because if you see the press release that was issued, but also the conversations that happen between the Sri Lankan government and the Indian government, that they are looking at Indian investments in about 7 to 8 sectors. How do they plan to balance the kind of investments that the Chinese make and the kind of investments that the Indians make? Because if we have to see a repeat of the Eastern Container Terminal story, I think it would be very, very difficult for Indian investors to find space in Sri Lanka. And you rightly said, I think the investment policies that Sri Lanka makes will be very important in the coming weeks and months.
Well, I think, as I said, it is really a kind of a situation of transition, especially moreover, given the fact, as I said, that Sri Lanka is still recovering from the COVID pandemic. They've had some experience with the Sinovac. Also, the other thing is the Chinese model of economic development. I think because of I would say it's kind of a genetic fault in that model. Because of that, I think a certain chastening is taking place. So, of course, the money is large and therefore it's quite tempting. But on the other hand, if the feeling is developing that it's not quite a viable model of economic cooperation, I think in that case, that is something from where it can be a starting point, not just for India, but other countries which are like-minded in that sense.
Having seen Sri Lanka certainly over the last 10 years, I mean, when the Sirisena government came in, the same thing about Chinese investments and then went right back and welcomed everything from China. I think this is an evolving story, and I think we will see many more turns and twists and turns and revisiting old issues and old decisions in Sri Lanka.
To add here a little bit, one approach that I see emerging in the Indian case, of course, is to actually develop these linkages as close and as diverse as possible. For example, the External Minister did talk about, the projects for air and sea connectivity. So these are important. They're important things. And also the larger diversification of the economy. I mean, the agrarian sector, the fisheries sector.
I think we'll have to judge Sri Lanka by its deeds and not by its words. I think we've heard the words.
I understand that, it's a different country with a different political system. So obviously it has different internal dynamic. But I'm quite sure that what's happened in the current phase is that our relations are getting closer because Sri Lankans realize that India is a country they cannot ignore. So earlier, the temptation of playing one against the other, that is tapering off. That's important. And this is an opportunity for us to actually develop these kind of linkages so that, as I said, they become even closer, they understand the benefits of it, and bring in, of course, let's say, more sober kind of economic investment there, whether it's Japan or through the IMF and so on and so forth. But I also want to make this point, I think it's a very important one, the Sri Lankans in their statement. He has also talked about, the Tamil issue, how, ultimately, if the country is not at peace with itself, obviously the country will have all of these jerky kind of sort of development in the future. So I think what we require a slow and patient handling approach. And I think, as I see the situation today, I think we are in a somewhat better position to actually, in a way, to shape these developments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
This is All India Radio, giving you the news. For quick news updates round the clock, follow us on Twitter @AIR News Alerts.
The Indian government on Wednesday said that the Department of Space is revising the existing policies to facilitate private sector participation in space activities. In a written reply in the Lok Sabha, the Minister of State in the Prime Minister's office, Dr. Jitendra Singh, said a new policy framework is being drafted to address various space sectors such as spacecom, remote sensing, technology transfer, navigation, space transportation, space exploration, and space situational awareness. He said in the Startup India portal, around 75 startups are shown under the space technology category. He further said these numbers are not exhaustive as some of the startups registered under other categories are also involved in the space domain.
Moving on to sports, in cricket, India won the second ODI against West Indies by 44 runs. Chasing a victory target of 238 runs, West Indies were bowled out for 193 runs in 46 overs at the Narendra Modi Stadium in Ahmedabad. When earlier put to bat, India scored 237 for 9 in stipulated 50 overs. For India, Surya Kumar Yadav scored 64 runs, while KL Rahul made 49 runs. Virat Kohli scored 18 runs. For West Indies, Alzari Joseph and Odin Smith took 2 wickets each. With this, India has an unassailable 2-0 lead in the series. And now a report from the business world.
The Sensex climbed 657 points or 1.14% to finish at 58,466, while the Nifty surged 197 points or 1.14% to settle at 17,464. In global stock markets, Asian and European stocks advanced after a strong session on Wall Street, while US Treasury yields held near multi-year highs ahead of closely watched inflation data this week. Hong Kong's Hang Seng jumped 2.1%. In Japan's Nikkei 225 surged 1.1%. China's Shanghai Composite Index and Korea's Kospi both climbed 0.8%. Singapore's Straits Times ended 0.7% up. European share markets were up in intraday trade. Oil prices locked marginal losses. In intraday trade, Brent crude was trading around $90.50 per barrel. Anubha Rohatgi for World News, All India Radio.
And now let us take a look at the major developments around the world as reported in the foreign press. The Times of India carried the headline, Nepal government's row with China may flare up over alleged encroachment. In another report, the publication said that the China-backed Colombo port city has again come under the spotlight for wrong reasons after the authorities broke their promise and imposed variable charges on people visiting the site. Daily Star reports that Bangladesh has made all areas under railways, including the train bogies and stations, as tobacco-free zones. BSS reports that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has invited the Bangladesh Foreign Minister Dr. A.K. Abdul Momen to visit Washington D.C. to mark the 50 years of bilateral ties. SCMP reports the European Union is set to hold talks in the coming weeks with China over its alleged breach of global trade rules in a dispute with Lithuania. And now a quick look at the headlines once again. External Affairs Minister of India Dr. Jai Shankar to begin his 6-day visit to Australia and the Philippines from Thursday. India takes strong exception to China-Pakistan joint statement's references to Jammu and Kashmir, asserts Union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh inalienable part of India. UN's Migration Agency warns that Afghans, especially women and girls, are facing increasing vulnerabilities and protection risks. India's High Commission in Ottawa issues advisory amidst ongoing protests. CBSE to conduct the second-term board examinations in offline mode for classes 10th and 12th from the 26th of April. Science and Technology Minister Dr. Jitendra Singh asserts government working to make India the global leader in space technology. And in cricket, India beat West Indies by 44 runs in the second ODI in Ahmedabad. And now, before we end, let us listen to Mahatma Gandhi's favorite bhajan, Vaishnav Jan, by artists from Cuba. And with that, we end this bulletin. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with the next edition of World News.